Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to just wait about 30 seconds for more people to join. So hang tight and we'll be with you momentarily. And if you're just joining, we're just going to wait. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining our webinar today. We get to talk about one of my favorite topics, the decarbonization of the built environment, particularly through carbon offsets. And I am joined today by one of my favorite business partners, Mark Chen, CEO and founder of CNaught, who is the company that Green Builder Media is partnering with to streamline access to high quality carbon offsets. But lots more about that in a minute. If any of you do not know me, I'm Sara Gutterman. I am the CEO and co-founder of Green Builder Media. Always thrilled to have the opportunity to talk with our audience and present to you today, again, about one of my very favorite topics. I first just want to thank Mary Kessner, our production manager, who's the wizard behind the curtain, making it all happen, as well as Victoria Muharski, who helped to arrange this webinar today, and Whirlpool Corporation for their generous partnership and sponsorship of our Next Generation Influencer Group and our Today's Homeowner program. Whirlpool is committed to being the best global kitchen and laundry company in constant pursuit of improving life at home. And in an increasingly digital world, Whirlpool is driving purposeful innovation to meet the evolving needs of customers through its diverse brand portfolio. So thank you very much to Whirlpool for your partnership and support. With that, I'm going to go ahead and dive in. And today's webinar is titled Reduce, Offset, and Repeat, the Path to Carbon Neutrality. I'm going to go ahead and just provide some context about what is happening with respect to the decarbonization of the built environment and why carbon offsets are so important. And then I'm going to pass the mic over to Mark so that he can talk more specifically about carbon offsets, carbon offset projects, and how we are working together, Green Builder Media and CNaught, to, as I mentioned a little earlier, streamline access to the highest integrity carbon offset projects possible. So I've been in, Green Builder Media is turning 20 next year, and so I've been in the sustainability world for at least that long. And before co-founding Green Builder Media, I was in venture capital, and we had a niche where we invested in organic foods and natural products. So I've been doing this for a while. And I can honestly tell you that I have never been so excited about the rate and pace of change. And that is true, even with the results of the recent election. I think that green building and decarbonization and sustainability is very protected. We might have to pivot our messaging a little bit to align green building with ongoing cost savings and enhanced profitability, because clearly the economy is top of mind for everyone. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I'm just very excited about the robust conversations that we, Green Builder Media, are having with building professionals of all kinds, from the top 10, 30, 50 builders in the country to other types of developers and architects and designers and code officials and municipalities and realtors and other lenders and other stakeholders, as well as consumers, homeowners and home buyers, about how we get to a net zero carbon built environment. And we really believe that there are three main pillars that are fundamental as we decarbonize the built environment, and that's getting to net zero carbon emissions from homes and buildings. So the first pillar really is focused on utilizing sustainable design and construction practices and techniques. And so that starts with climate responsive design. It also includes building science and green building and construction best practices. The second pillar is the meticulous specification of low carbon products from low carbon companies. So it's specifying products that have, say, environmental product declarations or other similar sustainability certifications from companies that have solid ESG, environmental, social, and governance, or corporate sustainability practices. To be quite honest with you, it doesn't really matter if a company calls it ESG or if they just call it corporate sustainability. The fundamentals are the fundamentals. It's really the same thing. But the third pivotal pillar to getting to a net zero carbon built environment today includes carbon offsets. And so again, you'll hear a lot more about those in terms of what a carbon offset is, why it's particularly important, and how to choose high versus low quality and integrity carbon offsets. Let me provide a little bit of context about why decarbonizing the built environment and really our entire economy is important. It's because of this trifecta of the environmental, social, and financial reality. So from an environmental standpoint, we've hit 1.5 degrees warming in the last 12 months. We're going to 2 degrees in the next 12 months. And it's not so much that climate scientists believe that all of our ecosystems are going to collapse if we go over 2 degrees warming, but it's just simply that over that threshold, their climate models don't work because of what's called a threat multiplier of climate change, meaning we're just flying blind over 2 degrees. We don't know what's going to happen. We do know that as the planet continues to warm, cycles become more frequent and intense, whether that's extreme temperatures or climate events like superstorms, hurricanes, wildfires, drought. We're seeing that in our day-to-day lives. This is just something that's happening and playing out. Doesn't really matter how or why it happened at this point, but it's happening. In terms of the social reality, there are clearly higher levels than ever of climate anxiety. 77% of millennials and Gen Zs consider the future to be frightening because of climate change. 56% think that humanity is doomed. That's not 6% or 16%. That's very high. It's over half. And so, we need to start providing very real climate solutions to address this rising and surging climate anxiety. And then the third piece of why this is so important is the financial reality, whereby investors, lenders, supply chain partners, municipalities, and other stakeholders now believe that companies, whether those are building professionals or manufacturers, that have strong corporate, social, and environmental and governance policies, or just corporate sustainability policies, actually are less risky as partners, as people who access financing, because they are able to mitigate the risks of climate change better, whether that's looking at resiliency, whether that's looking at supply chain disruption. But these companies with strong corporate sustainability strategies are now considered to be lower risk from a financial standpoint. And all of this is particularly important in the built environment because of how conspicuously consumptive homes and buildings are. So here in the US, homes and buildings account for about 40% of our nation's total energy use, 70% of electricity use, 40% of total emissions. And while we need to reduce emissions from the built environment by about half by 2030 and about by 100% by 2050, not if we're going to stay under that 2 degrees warming threshold, not even 1% of our buildings today are considered to be net zero carbon. So as you can see, there's a huge opportunity, but there's also a lot of work to be done. So let's look at some of the market dynamics that are shifting us towards the decarbonization of the built environment. The first is consumer pull-through, consumer demand. We're seeing mushrooming consumer demand for decarbonization, even in today's economic environment. And that's really because homeowners, and I don't have this data in this presentation because I literally am just analyzing it right now, but I'm going to share a piece of data from our annual State of the Industry survey, which it's interesting because this year it's very clear that the economy is top of mind for our consumer audience. We reach millions of early adopter and first movers who are committed to sustainability. And historically, sustainability was really the #1 issue, with the economy kind of secondary. This year, that has flipped, and it's very clear that the economy is top of mind. If you're interested in that, I think December 4th or 5th, I'm giving a webinar on this state of the industry data, so look for that. It's very interesting. But point is that what is very clear is that consumers still want green homes, but one of the main drivers is that they believe that energy efficient, all electric, healthy, resilient homes will actually save them money in the long term on monthly utility bills and ongoing operating costs. And if they have the one home that stands in the neighborhood after a superstorm or a wildfire and they don't have to rebuild, think about the cost savings there. So there's now a connection between having green homes and sustainable living with cost savings. And that's really where, as I said earlier, we as an industry have an opportunity to pivot our messaging around decarbonization from something that's nice or essential in order to hit our climate goals to something that's nice and essential for hitting your financial goals. The good news is that we know that homeowners and consumers in general believe that decarbonization is helpful to business, that it results in enhanced innovation, it generates positive brand equity, it yields greater financial returns, and it mitigates risk. We also know that living in a net zero carbon home is becoming more and more important, especially to millennials and Gen Zs, but across all 4 generations that are impacting the housing market. I don't have traditionalists or Gen Alpha just because they don't have a big influence at this point on the housing market. Millennials are, over half of home purchase applications in the 52 to 54% year over year right now. Gen Zs are just starting on their home buying journey, but they're definitely, their growth curve is going to grow like a hockey stick over the next several years with more and more impact on the housing market. So this is a value. Living in a net zero carbon home is a value that these younger generations are bringing to the home buying process. And we can also see that younger generations, millennials and Gen Zs, have a very high willingness to invest in sustainability upgrades if those upgrades will lower their cost of home ownership over time. Again, that goes towards what I was talking about in terms of connecting sustainability features and benefits with long-term cost savings. You can see millennials and Gen Zs are the dark purple line, whereas the middle blue line is a measure of consumers when we add in boomers and Xers. So that willingness goes down a little bit, meaning older generations are a little less willing to invest in those sustainability upgrades than younger generations. And then builders consistently underestimate at least what the younger generations say that they will invest in. And the way that I interpret that is that builders might have a more accurate perspective on what they will actually pay versus what they say they will pay. But even so, we're still tweaking at the margins here, right? We're over 50% across all of these categories. And so clearly, there's a willingness to pay and then the reality there as well. We're also seeing increased demand. This is a question that we've asked to our builders. They are seeing increased demand from their home buyers for things like energy efficient insulation, windows and doors, lighting, smart home systems and controls, heat pump technologies, solar plus storage, etc. And our builders are more willing to adopt enabling technologies like demand-side energy management systems, cool roof systems, high-performance building envelope systems today more so than ever before. So that was, kind of describing the market dynamics of consumer pull and builder push. Now I want to focus for just a minute on the changing and shifting regulatory landscape. And this is really important. And this is the main reason why I believe that green building is incredibly protected. Again, regardless of what happens at a federal level, there may be rollbacks to energy code or the HUD ruling or for affordable housing and energy efficiency or perhaps environmental protections. But green building largely regulations and codes largely happen on a local, municipal, and a state level, not on a federal level. And so when we look at the regulatory landscape for green building and the decarbonization of the built environment, I actually predict that the next 5 years between 2025 and 2030 it's going to be a very, very active time frame in a good way, meaning there are cities like Aspen and Burlington, Vermont, and San Francisco that have set net zero carbon targets by 2030, meaning they want to reduce emissions from their cities entirely by 2030. There are other cities like New York City, Seattle, Los Angeles that have set 40 to 50% reduction targets by 2030. Most of these cities are relying on energy efficiency measures, electrification of the built environment and transportation, and the adoption of renewable energy to hit those goals. And a lot of them are kind of waking up and they're like, oh my gosh, it's 2025. We have 5 years to hit our goals. That's not a lot. And so I think that the next 5 years are going to be very active with respect to implementing codes and policies and legislation at, again, a local, municipal, and state level so that these various different entities can hit their 2030 goals. We're also seeing climate risk disclosure requirements. We saw that last year, California passed 2 climate laws that are going to require scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reporting for companies that have $1 billion in revenue or more. But those climate risk disclosure requirements aren't only going to impact those large companies. Many of the tech behemoths, by the way, like Apple and Google and Microsoft that are located in California are totally behind these climate risk disclosure requirements because they're largely already doing them. They're already reporting scope 1, 2, and 3. But because of the scope 3 reporting, which means that all of these big companies have to get reports from everyone in their supply chain, everyone they do business with. It's bankers, it's lenders, it's attorneys, it's anyone that's working on offices, whether you're a product manufacturer or a builder or a remodeler or contractor. Everyone's going to have to provide some kind of reporting to these large companies. So if you touch any large company that's based in California, you're gonna have to provide reporting. So game on, it's here. Of course, we saw the SEC pass their climate risk disclosure requirements for just scope 1 and 2, not 3, but that's shifting the landscape in terms of what is going to have to be calculated, measured, and then reported on as well. Earlier this year, we saw the Department of Energy release a zero emissions building definition, which is always a harbinger for what's going to happen with respect to codes and requirements across the country. The EPA put out a low embodied carbon construction materials labeling program, again, to kind of set some guardrails to understand what low carbon products and materials look like. This isn't a bullet point on the slide, but ResNet and various different entities are working on an ANSI standard 1550 that will streamline the measurement of embodied carbon for residential projects. That's going to go a long way towards really streamlining and creating a formula for measuring embodied carbon. And then the Biden administration came out with voluntary carbon offset guidelines to really differentiate what a high integrity carbon offset project is versus a low integrity carbon offset project is. And then again, we're starting already to see changes in codes and mandates. So in July, California passed a code for commercial buildings over 100,000 square feet that have to now start reporting on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. In Boston, same thing for large commercial buildings. Builders and developers effectively are now required to create net zero carbon plans when they go in to get a permit. While those are for commercial buildings right now, they will trickle into the residential sector. We've also seen a changing valuation metric, and this really started happening when millennials started getting into the market, even before the pandemic, where they started looking at that full value of homeownership as opposed to just upfront cost or lowest price per square foot. And that ethic has been pulled through, again, in our state of the industry data it's just hot off the press. You're really the first group that's even hearing about it because I've just been analyzing it over the last couple of days. Across all 4 generations, boomers, Xers, millennials, and Zs, all of them now say that they look more at ongoing operating costs and full value of home ownership as opposed to just upfront costs. And that's for the first time ever. And then, of course, from a financial standpoint, rebates and incentives, largely from the Inflation Reduction Act in red and blue states, are really benefiting builders through 45L, and then also homeowners to enhance the energy efficiency and electrify their homes. Now, the next element the next pillar that I want to talk about is just kind of understanding how we decarbonize the built environment beyond the market dynamics. So there's two kinds of carbon that needs to be measured as we look at emissions from homes and buildings. And this is true also for products and manufacturing and other aspects of our economy. But for right now, I'm just going to talk about homes and buildings. There's embodied carbon, which basically means it's a measure of everything that goes into a home. I'll just talk about a home for now, up until the day that home is sold or occupied. So from when the very first material for any product that goes into a home is extracted, to transportation, to manufacturing, to packaging, to more transportation, to installation. For every product that goes into that home. And there's about 20,000 product inputs that go into a typical American home. So as you can imagine, measuring embodied carbon is complex. We've been able to streamline it. We have a calculator that actually Mark and his team created that helps builders measure embodied carbon. As I said, there's the ANSI standard coming out, which will streamline it even further. There's some other really good tools like the BEAM calculator. And then there are other groups like Construction Instruction that's working with builders to create life cycle assessments or LCAs for their homes to look at embodied carbon. So there's various different ways that you can measure embodied carbon. Either on your own or in conjunction with partners. And then the operational carbon basically takes over once a home is occupied, and it's just the ongoing emissions from the operations of that home. So if a home is net zero energy, it's got solar and storage, it's producing all of the power that home needs. As you can imagine, the operational carbon is either significantly reduced or eliminated. If it's a grid-tied home, the way that we measure operational carbon is by actually looking at the energy mix for the utility. And if it's a relatively clean utility, I'll use NV Energy as an example, or, there's a lot of utilities that have really cleaned up their energy mix and are trying to provide energy using large solar arrays and wind power, and in some cases hydro or even geothermal. And the cleaner the utility, for a grid-tied home, the lower the operational carbon calculation. So when we look at how we get to net zero carbon, it really involves deploying these sustainable design, building science, and green building and construction best practices, ranging from implementing, passive heating, cooling, ventilation strategies to enhancing energy efficiency, electrifying homes. We cannot ignore health and wellness, that, even though it maybe, indoor air quality systems doesn't directly pertain to decarbonization, we can't sacrifice health and wellness. Interestingly, solar increases embodied carbon, but it reduces operational carbon. So net, solar is always a good idea. Advanced technologies for demand-side energy management, of course, and then always understanding, your inspections, your testing, your measurements for performance, and ongoing operations. After we address performance, then we move into the specification of low-carbon products from low-carbon companies. And this one's hard because, as I mentioned, there's about 20,000 product inputs into the average American home, about 450 SKUs, and there aren't that many low-carbon products with environmental product declarations that basically those EPDs measure the full cycle, life cycle, environmental performance or impact of a product. So there's just not that many that we could. I'd love to build one of our Vision House projects with all products that have EPDs, but we just can't because there's not that many out there. And then beyond the certifications, the EPDs or other sustainability certifications, we have to also look at the sustainability practices of those companies themselves. Do they have ESG strategies in place and reporting? Are they reporting on their scope 1, 2, and or 3 emissions and other climate risk disclosures? And I've been talking about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So just in case you don't know what those are, I made an assumption that you did. Scope 1 is basically direct emissions that a company burns internally. Scope 2 is indirect emissions that a company buys, right? So say from a utility. So both of those have to do with energy use. But then scope 3 is everything else associated with operating buildings, employee travel, commutes, how products are actually used by the end users, and then end of life or disposal issues. It's packaging, it's again, manufacturing, it's kind of all other emissions. And so scope 3 can be 80 to 90, even 95% of the emissions of a company. So as you can imagine, that's why I think the SEC did not include scope 3 for now in their climate risk disclosure requirements, just because it's hard to get your arms around, and it's going to take time for companies to do that. Now, the third and essential step of decarbonizing the built environment is carbon offsets. So in case you're not familiar with carbon offsets, one carbon offset is the equivalent of taking 1 ton of carbon out of it. And there are a lot of different types of carbon offset projects right now. There are nature-based projects that, for example, include things like forest management and conservation, tree planting, biodiversity protection. And then there are technology-based projects that say include landfill gas capture or capping abandoned oil and gas wells that would otherwise be emitting carbon and perhaps methane into the air. Or we have a really cool project that I love that's in the Front Range in Colorado near Denver in Fort Lupton that is taking agricultural waste, and instead of allowing that agricultural waste to decompose and emit carbon and methane into the air, it's turning it into biochar and storing it into the ground. And then, of course, there are direct air capture projects, which are using those big fans. There's I know a couple of these in Scandinavia where they're pulling carbon out of the air and then storing it into the ground, into limestone or into other types of soil and rock types. So there are, as I mentioned earlier, there's a big difference between high quality and low quality carbon offsets. High quality offsets do things like address additionality, meaning they're not issuing offsets for a project that would have been done anyway. So I get a lot of questions, say, from builders who are saying, hey, I am building an energy efficient community and it's going to have solar, and can I issue carbon offsets for that? And the real answer is, well, no, because you're doing that project anyway. So you don't address that additionality. High quality projects also provide robust, transparent, and accurate reporting and analytics. They eliminate double accounting, meaning they don't plant a tree and then sell that tree planting through an offset 10 or 100 or 1,000 times. The voluntary carbon offset market was getting a little bit of a bad rap because of double accounting by some bad actors. Fortunately, a lot of that's been cleaned up because of now this increased demand for transparent and accountable reporting. High quality projects also have third-party certification and validation and well-defined pricing and benefits and results. They also have permanence to their offset. So for us, what we do is if you buy an offset from us, we actually retire those offsets so they cannot be exchanged or bought and sold after the fact. So this webinar is not intended to be a sales pitch, but just informationally. And I'll tell this story very briefly. I had an aha moment, and not a good one, about a year and a half ago now, where I jumped up out of bed at 3 a.m. and I was pacing around my house and I was like, oh my God, we're not going to make it. not going to make it. We've hit 1.5 degrees. We're going to 2 degrees. What are we going to do? And then I settled myself down because, I talked myself into the fact that we do know how to decarbonize the built environment. We know how to electrify buildings and transportation. We know how to get to regenerative agriculture and how to reimagine manufacturing and industry and all these things we need to do to decarbonize. But so I kind of calmed myself down, but then I was like, well, these things take time and we need to act now, quick, fast, now. Climate's changing. We've got to act now. What can we do? What can we do as Green Builder Media? What can I do as just a human being? And it became very clear that carbon offsets were the answer to get us to that last mile, right? We have to address performance. We have to specify those low carbon products. But then the next piece is we have to buy carbon offsets. And so we did a bunch of due diligence. The long story short, we met Mark and his team actually through Gene Myers at Thrive Homes, through a project, one of our Vision House projects that we did with Thrive, where we bought offsets from CNaught. And it became very clear that CNaught was the right partner for us. So as we have partnered with CNaught, CNaught has a fleet of PhDs who vets carbon offset projects and creates portfolios. So now, as I said, we're working with building professionals, namely, mostly builders and developers and manufacturers as well, to purchase the highest quality, highest integrity carbon offsets. In addition to those offsets, again, which get retired and we have ongoing reporting for, and I'll let Mark talk more about that. We're also providing training and education and assistance and collateral material that help our partners who purchase carbon offsets communicate about carbon offsets. What are they? Why are they important? Why are they particularly important in the built environment? Why should your business executives care? Why should your home buyers or your customers care? And this goes now beyond, as we've seen, since the economy is so important and top of mind, this goes beyond, this is a nice thing to do for the planet, or we have to do this to hit our climate goals. This now goes to value that's being created for your business, ultimate, cost savings in terms of mitigating risk. So there's a lot of talking points, there's a lot of training and education that we are now providing, again, to really create that layered message beyond the fact that just carbon offsets are cool, which I really think they are. And then we are creating this front lines of climate action, so to speak. So this a growing network of builders, developers, other building professionals, manufacturers, homeowners, and other stakeholders who are really leading the building industry into a new era of net zero, and we'll really be spotlighting and highlighting those entities next year. If you are a builder or a building professional, what we can do for you and with you is we'll help you calculate your embodied carbon using the specs for your projects. We have a couple of different portfolios that you can choose from in terms of that each of them have a different mix of projects and therefore different pricing. Nature-based projects tend to be less expensive. The technology-based projects tend to be a little bit more expensive. And then we can figure out how many offsets you need to purchase in order to deliver a net zero embodied carbon home. And that ranges for a high performance home. It's really not that expensive, right? It's somewhere, let's say in the $750 or $800, maybe up to $1,500, maybe up to $2,000, depending on the size and how much concrete, and if you're using steel or, insulation that has high embodied factor. Then on the operational side, we're actually working with builders and developers and now some lenders who are, we're packaging 5, 10, and 30-year operational carbon offset packages to sell to home buyers. We're bringing the lenders in to incorporate these packages into closing costs. And, it depends on, again, the performance of the home, the energy mix of the utility, if it's a grid-tied home. But again, these are not very expensive packages. Maybe they range from, say, $140 to, $400 or $500. The last thing that I have to say before I kick it over to Mark, because as usual, I took more time than I planned to and had intended to, but something is better than nothing. Right? So if you are a building professional, if you're a builder or manufacturer or other professional. If I think that, again, as we've seen, the cost to offset a project, a home, a community, a building, it's not that high relative to, total value and sales pricing. For your business, you can see here that, when we look at, say, average emissions from employee commutes or office emissions, it's not huge numbers. You can really offset an employee's commute and office, emissions from them being in offices for less than $100 a year. If you want to look at offsetting your house or give a gift to a friend or colleagues, according to the EPA, the average American household emits but the equivalent of about $140 worth of offsets, per year. So we're not talking about break the bank numbers. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to pass things over to Mark. He'll get a little bit more into, again, portfolios of carbon offsets and projects themselves. But I really encourage you to look at our carbon offsets marketplace. Go to greenbuildermedia.com, click on the nav bar where it says carbon offsets. That microsite has pretty much all the information that you need. And with that, Mark, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Let me share my screen here. Let's see here. All right. Let's see, sorry about this. You cannot see that. I apologize. Need to move things around here. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, for taking the time and inviting me to share a little more about carbon credits or carbon offsets, and I'll get into the distinction. And you provided a great set of background already about some of the differences of embodied versus operational carbon, but just wanted to take just a few minutes to double click on a few of the items that you brought up. The first one is this distinction between embodied carbon and operational carbon. Particularly in the built environment space, I think it's very easy to think about operational carbon, right? It's what everybody thinks about in terms of net zero, full electrification. But as you mentioned, we really need to be thinking about embodied as well. I mean, for your typical home, embodied carbon can be more than half of the overall life cycle emissions of a property. And so if we're not, as we move towards net zero homes and fully electrify and have renewable energy powering those homes, that ratio is going to get even bigger. And in some areas, as you mentioned before, if you add solar to the roof, that actually has a huge benefit for the overall life cycle and certainly on the operational carbon, but it actually adds to the embodied carbon side of the equation. So it's something that we really focus on, and it's an area where really there are very few tools out there. All the good work that Sarah, you and your team at Green Builder Media are doing to try to work with manufacturers to get EPDs so that buyers can make better decisions or more informed decisions on the amount of embodied carbon. But at the end of the day, we're building things that require materials, and that's going to have a carbon footprint. And so when we look at the typical home, most of the embodied carbon is coming from, basically two places: concrete and insulation, right? I mean, the ratio between them can change depending on, how thick your concrete pour is, how thick your slab is, do you have a basement? Insulation can be highly variable. Are you using expanded polystyrene as insulation in some places? What's the propellant if you're using it for blowing in insulation? Those can change the numbers pretty dramatically. But we see your typical family home being anywhere between 40 to 60 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent on average. But when you get down to it, it's mostly concrete, insulation, a little bit of roofing. The other pieces, some flooring, but the choice of appliances really doesn't have a huge driver at this level. And so, as you think about how do you actually put this into place, you're out there building homes or you're buying homes, how do you figure out like what your actual embodied carbon is? There are a number of tools out there. Sarah mentioned some of them already. One-click LCA, I think on this list is probably the only one that is costs money, and it is highly detailed, and you will get audit sort of ready LCA reports, but it can be a little bit of a learning curve to try to figure out how to use. You do need to import most of the EPDs into the tool. Other tools that are readily available, EC3 is a great one. RMI has a free tool out there called Beam. EHDD created Epic. Epic is a little bit more towards the design side of things. So early on in the process, before you even know what materials, it can help you with identifying what's the art of the possible. And so, I talked about all that to say, we no matter what we do, as much as we try to, design and construct for a low carbon footprint and use low carbon materials and products, we will have a footprint at the end of the day. And really, carbon credits are the best way, the easiest way, the most flexible way of addressing that footprint today. And as we mentioned earlier, there have been some challenges with the space, but at the end of the day, we've resolved a lot of the challenges, and carbon credits are being trusted and utilized by many leading folks in the field. In fact, there are a lot of certification bodies, whether it's zero carbon certification in Canada, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but climate neutral. Local Law 97 is a New York city law mandating carbon disclosure and reporting, as well as management. These certification programs all permit as well as encourage the use of carbon credits to get below a certain threshold to meet the certification standards. And then really quickly, when I talk about credits versus offsets, because you'll hear these terms used somewhat interchangeably. Carbon credits are really sort of the umbrella term for these financial instruments that you can purchase and drive investment in projects that reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And carbon offsets are essentially when you're using those credits and you're retiring them, and you're doing so in a way that addresses emissions that you're creating elsewhere, right? And so in the case of home building, certainly we can talk about them as carbon offsets, but oftentimes I will talk about them interchangeably as either offsets or credits, since credits is the umbrella term. There are multiple types of carbon credits out there. Sarah already started talking a little bit about the distinction between sort of nature-based versus engineered. Just wanted to run through sort of what we consider the four major categories of carbon credits. And really they fall along two dimensions, right? The first one is, are you reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that would otherwise be in the atmosphere, or are you removing carbon dioxide that is already in the atmosphere? And then are you doing so via technology and machines and engineering work, or are you doing so with nature-based solutions? And so the most common way of fulfilling carbon credits today is by reduction. It's just a lot easier and simpler, as well as cheaper, to not emit carbon dioxide in the first place, right? Why stop digging the hole before you start trying to fill the hole back in? And so reduction projects are much more scalable. They are readily available across the board, across both technology, as Sarah mentioned, with landfill gas capture, refrigerant destruction, and a lot of gases that are even more powerful than carbon dioxide fall into this bucket, right? Methane is anywhere between 25 and 100 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, depending on how you measure it. Certain refrigerants can be 2,000 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so even just saving, a 10-pound container of refrigerant and destroying it in a proper manner can be highly effective and can compare to tons of carbon dioxide. And then conservation, right? Nature-based conservation, saving trees, keeping carbon locked up where it should belong, which is in vegetation. And then on the flip side, we can also start doing net removal, right? So on the nature side, start planting net new trees, reforest areas that were previously cut down. And then technology-based removal. You know, the fans in Iceland that are running on geothermal energy or electricity, pulling air and running it over substrates to literally pull carbon dioxide, absorb it out of the atmosphere, and then cart it away and store it underground. And so these are all 4 different categories. You can think of the costs sort of going in this direction as well, going from least cost in a clockwise manner to most expensive. Some of the credits for technology-based removal can be upwards of $1,000 per ton. And then, you know, you also certainly need to consider the key components of integrity. As mentioned earlier, you know, there are some challenges with purchasing credits. Unfortunately, when we at CNaught look out at the market of available credits with our fleet of PhDs and our third-party ratings advisors, you know, unfortunately, 95% of the credits that we see out in the market don't meet our bar for integrity, right? And that's when we look at additionality or over-crediting in particular. Durability and double counting for sure are issues to consider, but the biggest hurdle, the tallest hurdle to jump over is essentially additionality and over-crediting. Like, if we did not purchase these credits, what would happen otherwise? Would this project happen? And are you calculating the amount of carbon savings or reduction appropriately? And that's something that we have our internal team looking at. And then what I wanted to sort of wrap with is, how are folks using these today, right? How are carbon credits, carbon offsets being used to help bring down the carbon footprint of a building, and what does that mean for the owner, the builder, the developer? So I just wanted to dive through Scotia Plaza, which is a skyscraper in Toronto, Canada, owned and operated by KingSett Capital, and they were seeking certification under Canada's Zero Carbon Building Performance Standard. And this is a performance standard that takes into account full life cycle emissions of a building for both embodied as well as operations of a building. This is an existing property, existing structure. So of course, the only way to address the embodied carbon was through the use of carbon credits. And so, you know, what Kit wrote or provided at the end of the day was, you know, we've heard from tenants who have said that they're signing in the building because it's on a path of decarbonization versus others in the market. You know, is a real driver, that certification of having corporate tenants that have their own reporting and carbon footprint needs, right? They're trying to reduce their scope 3 emissions, right? To move into properties and buildings that have zero carbon emissions or zero emissions, so they can report out to their investors, to their consumers, to their regulators as well. So they're seeing a pickup in demand as a result. So let me just, you know, leave you with sort of what next, right? Like, what should you take away from all this this content? One is, you know, step number 1, optimize for the operational and embodied carbon, right? It's the 3 steps that Sara mentioned earlier. Design and construct with carbon in mind across both of those dimensions, embodied as well as operational. You know, you choose those products and processes to minimize the amount of carbon that goes into the structure itself. And then you can use carbon credits, carbon offsets to address whatever you can't eliminate. And then when you do so, make sure that you're buying in a high integrity manner, that you're not just buying the project that's down the street because you can go drive by it. Don't buy the projects that just look good, because we call those, you know, charismatic projects that maybe sound great, but, you know, you peek under the hood and you could realize that they're not actually delivering on the carbon benefits that you were hoping for, right? And when that happens, you're basically just greenwashing, right? Because you're buying what essentially looks good, but doesn't actually have any real impact on the environment. And then lastly, even when you do purchase those credits, make sure you buy in a diversified portfolio, that you're not just buying, you know, from one project. We very much, as CNaught, view purchasing carbon offsets like you're investing your, you know, 401k portfolio, right? You wouldn't put it all in one stock, even if it is Tesla. but you would want to diversify it across a number of different categories, a number of different projects, a number of different locations. And if you don't have the capability to do that internally, we at CNaught, or certainly Green Builder, can help you with any of the steps in that process. So I'll stop there, and I think we'll take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark. I have a few questions that have come in. Before I do, though, I have a question for you. I know the answer to this, but can you talk a little bit about some of the specific projects in our portfolios, in our 3 portfolios, and just talk about those portfolios in general and how you and your team have crafted those and the difference in pricing?
Yeah, great question. So, great question. So, when we think about the portfolios, we are designing portfolios that really try to cover those 4 different categories, right? So the avoided emissions, the conservation projects, reforestation and afforestation, and then engineered removal. Most of our time, frankly, we spend on the first 3 categories, because that's where we have, there's just a lot more challenges in identifying projects, and that's where we have a head of science. We do our own due diligence on each of the projects that go into the different categories of the portfolio. And then for each of the projects that we take a look at, and I'll mention some in a second, we will also work with third-party ratings agencies. And so these are ratings agencies that are kind of like the S&Ps and Fitches and Moody's of the financial world, but specifically for carbon credits, right? They're not taking money from sellers. They're not being biased in their own ratings. And essentially, what we do is we make sure that at least one third-party ratings agency has rated the project well before it can be included in one of our portfolios. The projects themselves, I'll just give you a few examples that come to mind. You mentioned landfill gas. Landfill gas projects are a really effective way of capturing methane. Methane is 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. And in most countries, or many countries outside the United States, especially in developing countries such as Brazil, it is not mandated to cap your landfill. And so people are just dumping organic waste into an open pit. They're not covering it up. It turns into methane and it just leaks out. And it's relatively inexpensive to go in and essentially throw over, a polypropylene tarp, and then make sure that you also cover it with dirt, and then you install piping infrastructure to actually pull out that methane, and you burn it and generate electricity. Really effective way of keeping a really potent greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere. And then lastly, I'll end with, one other project I'll bring up is Kootznoowoo in Alaska. Kootznoowoo is actually a native tribe in Alaska on Prince of Wales Island. I think it's about 100,000 acres of forest land that had been previously cut down by forestry interests, paper and pulp producers, and now there's an afforestation project, a reforestation project going on there, being developed by the native tribe. And so it's projects like that where you go out there and they're just amazing to see what carbon credit, what funding through the sale of carbon credits can do, not just for the climate, but for the actual local population as well.
So that leads me to the next question, which is there's something called co-benefits associated with carbon offset projects that go beyond the environmental benefit to more of a social and community scale benefit. Yeah. Can you talk about what a co-benefit is and what you look for when you're picking projects?
Yeah, for sure. Co-benefits are incredibly powerful, partly because, so I just say, we take a look at projects from a carbon perspective. The first bar that projects need to get over is, do they have a positive impact on the climate? The very next question we ask is, what are the co-benefits, and why co-benefits sort of weigh into that calculus is, they're great. I mean, to be able to benefit biodiversity, or benefit the local population, or clean up the local water, right, above and beyond the climate benefits. But also we see co-benefits as being correlated with the long-term success of a project. right? If you don't have benefits for, in the case of Kutznu, if you're not helping the local, the native tribe that is responsible for that land, then if you fast forward 20 years, then the tribe has no interest in continuing to maintain that project and keep that carbon locked up, right? They might lease the land, back out to, somebody who wants to clear cut that property. So co-benefits are incredibly powerful. They can run the gamut from, literally economic benefits for the tribe. It can also lead to job creation. We see that a lot in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, where you're creating jobs to maintain these forests. You're providing funding for education, health initiatives in the local area as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. Just a couple more quick questions that have come in. Two quick ones for me, and then one for you, Mark. One, will there be rebates for new apartment construction projects? The answer is yes, there are multifamily rebates, and I would check with your local municipality or your state to see what kind of, say IRA related funding there is through 45L or for homeowners for those energy efficiency and electrification upgrades. There might be some utility incentives and rebates as well. Again, but those very much happen on a local or municipal level. So I just call, your local utility, call someone, your county administrator, and then you can also call your state energy office to learn more about those. The next quick question that came in for me was about I mentioned that there are about 20,000 product inputs and about 450 SKUs. So the question is, what's the difference between a product and a SKU? A SKU is basically a type of product. So you may have 20 different or 20 of the same products that are ordered, but they represent one SKU. So that's why you have 20,000 product inputs, but only 450 SKUs. Mark, for you, you mentioned an EHDD calculator, and the question was, what is the name of that tool?
That tool is called EPIC, EPIC.
Okay, super, great. Well, Mark, I think you answered all the questions that came up, including my own. Thank you so much. It's always nice to share a stage or a screen in this case with you. And really happy to have the opportunity to work with you and the CNaught team. Any last comments that you'd like to relay before we hop off?
Yeah, I would just say I'm really excited to be chatting about carbon and getting into the weeds about sort of like the sources of like the drivers of carbon in the built environment. When we started CNaught, it felt like we were educating a lot of the market, and now through your efforts and many other sort of like-minded folks, it seems to be growing in popularity and a lot more sort of evangelists and advocates. And so just happy to see the growth in interest. Yes,
I agree. So strap your seatbelt on because this is going to be a wild ride.
Yeah.
So thank you, Mark, for your time today. Thanks everybody who attended, and we look forward to talking a lot more about decarbonizing the built environment and carbon offsets. Again, for anyone who wants more information, please go to greenbuildermedia.com and check out the Cognition Carbon Offset Marketplace. I think my contact information is on there if you've got questions and you want to reach out. Thanks again to Mary Kessner and Victoria Muharski and to Whirlpool for their generous support. Thank you and have a wonderful day.